Across civilizations, separated by oceans, languages, and thousands of years, humanity has told the same stories, again and again, under different names. Empires rise, cultures evolve, religions form, and yet the core narratives remain strangely familiar. In ancient Greece, poets spoke of Titans and Olympians, beings of immense power shaping the structure of the world. In biblical texts, the story unfolds through God, man, obedience, and the fall from grace. In Mesopotamia, the oldest recorded myths describe gods emerging from primordial waters, floods that reset the world, and humans caught between divine forces. At first glance, these systems appear disconnected, products of isolated cultures attempting to explain their surroundings. Different regions, different gods, different beliefs. But when the names are stripped away, when Zeus is no longer Zeus, when Adam is no longer Adam, when Enlil is no longer Enlil, something begins to surface beneath the surface. A pattern, not a coincidence, not a copy, a structure. The same sequence of ideas appears repeatedly. Creation, order, awareness, human existence, knowledge, consequence, collapse, renewal. These are not just stories. They are recurring frameworks, ways of organizing reality into something understandable. This system is built on a simple but powerful premise. Different cultures are not telling different stories. They are describing the same underlying structures of reality using different symbols, characters, and language. Symbols become the interface. A god is not just a being, it is a role. A myth is not just a story, it is a pattern. A narrative is not just history, it is a model of how existence behaves. What changes is the surface. What remains is the structure beneath it. It is important to be clear about what this system is and what it is not. This is not a claim that all religions originate from a single source. It is not an attempt to prove that one mythology is true over another. It is not a hidden history theory or a reconstruction of lost knowledge. Instead, it is a framework of observation, a way to look at different traditions and ask, what role does this figure play? What stage of reality does this represent? Where have we seen this pattern before? When viewed this way, mythology stops being something distant and ancient. It becomes something immediate, something structural, something that mirrors how humans think, act, and experience the world today. Because these patterns are not confined to old texts. They appear in the way societies organize themselves, the way individuals make decisions, the cycles of growth, failure, and transformation, the tension between control and freedom, the pursuit of knowledge and the consequences that follow. The same archetypes that shaped myth now shape behavior. The same structures that governed ancient stories now govern modern systems. This is where the system becomes useful, not as a belief, but as a lens, a way to see patterns where before there were only disconnected pieces, a way to recognize that what appears complex may actually be repeating something simple, a way to understand that beneath every story, no matter how different it seems, there may be a shared foundation. And once that foundation is seen, it becomes difficult to unsee. Because the realization is not that myths are connected. The realization is deeper than that. It is that human understanding itself is patterned. Across civilization the same way, with nothing. Or at least that's how it appears. In Greek mythology, this beginning is called chaos. In Egyptian cosmology, it is known as none, the infinite dark waters that existed before creation. In Mesopotamian texts, it emerges as the Abzu, the deep, primordial ocean from which all life originates. Different names, different imagery, but the same idea. A beginning without structure, a state before definition, a condition where nothing is separated, labeled, or formed. This stage represents pure potential, no structure, no identity. It is often misunderstood as emptiness, but it is not empty. It is full, completely full, just not yet organized. It is everything before form. Before there are boundaries, there is no inside or outside. Before there are categories, there is no distinction between things. Before there is identity, there is no this or that. There is only undifferentiated existence. This is why ancient systems often describe this state using water. Water has no fixed shape. It takes the form of whatever contains it. It moves, shifts, and adapts. It represents something that is present, but not yet defined. Something that exists but has not yet become. In this state, there is no time as we understand it. Time requires sequence. Sequence requires change. Change requires structure, and structure has not yet emerged. So this first layer is not just the beginning of the world, it is the beginning of any system. Before a thought forms, there is a moment of mental stillness. Before a decision is made, there is a space of uncertainty. Before identity is defined, there is a period of openness. This same pattern appears at every scale, in the universe, in societies, in individuals. Chaos is not the opposite of order. It is what exists before order. And without it, nothing new can emerge. Because creation does not come from structure. It comes from potential being shaped. This is the paradox of chaos. It is both the absence of form and the source of all form. Everything that exists begins here, but chaos does not remain chaos. Something begins to shift. Patterns start to emerge. Distinctions begin to form. Forces separate and define themselves. From this undefined state, the first layer of structure appears. Not randomly, but inevitably. Because once potential exists, organization follows. And that is where the next stage begins. From chaos comes structure. Where there was once only undifferentiated potential fluid, undefined, without boundary, something begins to take shape. Distinctions emerge. Separation occurs. What was once everything at once begins to organize into something specific. This transition marks one of the most important shifts in every mythological system. It is not the creation of existence, but the organization of it. This stage is represented by figures such as Zeus in Greek mythology, Jupiter in Roman tradition, Enlil in Mesopotamian texts, and El in Canaanite belief. Though their names differ, their function remains consistent across cultures. They are not simply gods, they are archetypes of authority. They do not create reality from nothing. Instead, they impose structure onto what already exists. They divide sky from earth, establish hierarchy among beings, and define the rules that govern existence. In doing so, they transform chaos into something navigable, something that can be understood, lived within, and maintained. This is the foundation of systems, governments, and laws. It is the moment where existence stops being purely potential and becomes regulated. Authority in this sense is not merely control, it is definition. It draws lines where there were none. It determines what belongs and what does not. It assigns position, purpose, and limitation. Without this layer, reality would remain unstructured, impossible to engage with in any meaningful way. But beneath this visible layer of authority, represented by sky gods and rulers, there exists a deeper, more fundamental force. A force that does not rule through command, but through inevitability. This is represented by Cronus, known in Roman tradition as Saturn. While Zeus and similar figures represent active authority, the enforcement of order, Cronus represents something more absolute, time itself. Not time as measured by clocks, but time as a condition of existence. The force that ensures all things progress, change, decay, and eventually end. Cronus does not command systems. He defines the boundaries within which all systems must operate. Even authority is subject to time. Even structure cannot escape its limits. This is why Saturn has long been associated with symbols of structure and containment. The square, for example, represents stability, order, and limitation, something fixed and grounded, in contrast to the fluidity of chaos. The black cube, often referenced symbolically, reflects containment and form, reality confined within defined edges. The ring, most visibly associated with Saturn itself, represents cycles, boundaries, and enclosure. These symbols are not arbitrary. They reflect the nature of structured reality. Once chaos is organized, it becomes something measurable, something contained, something that operates within limits. This introduces a crucial understanding. Order is not purely liberating. It is also restrictive. Rules create stability, but they also define what cannot be done. Structure enables function, but it limits freedom. Hierarchy organizes, but it also controls. This dual nature is essential. Without order, nothing can function. But with order, everything becomes subject to constraint. This is the tension that defines this layer. Chaos is infinite but unusable. Order is functional but limiting. Between them, reality takes shape. The idea of Cronus or Saturn as a Lord of the Rings can be understood symbolically within this framework. Rings represent cycles and boundaries, the repetition of time and the containment of existence within structure. To rule the rings is not simply to hold power, but to exist at the level where cycles themselves are governed. It is to represent the framework within which all action, growth, and decay occur. This archetype is not confined to mythology. It appears clearly in modern life. Governments establish laws. Institutions define systems. Schedules regulate time. Contracts define obligation. These are all expressions of the same layer, order imposed onto potential. Deadlines, routines, and responsibilities are not separate from this archetype. They are its modern form. Through them, time becomes structured, action becomes regulated, life becomes organized into predictable patterns. This is what transforms existence into something livable, but also something bounded. The core insight of this stage is simple, but foundational. Order does not create reality, it makes reality function. It transforms chaos into structure, but in doing so, it introduces limits that shape everything that follows. And once structure exists, something new becomes possible. Not just existence, not just order, but awareness. Because once reality is defined, it can be observed. And that observation gives rise to the next stage, light. Before humans can act, they must perceive. Before systems can be navigated, they must be seen. Before structure can be understood, it must first be illuminated. After chaos is shaped into order, after boundaries are drawn and reality is structured, something new becomes possible. Not just existence within a system, but awareness of it. This is the stage of light. It is represented across cultures by figures such as Hyperion, the Titan associated with observation and the cycles of the heavens, Helios, the personification of the sun itself, and Ra, the central force of illumination and life in Egyptian cosmology. Though these figures differ in form and story, their function remains the same. They represent light not merely as a physical phenomenon, but as a principle, the ability to see. Light symbolizes awareness. It symbolizes observation. It symbolizes the recognition of patterns. Without light, structure exists, but it cannot be understood. Systems may function, but they cannot be interpreted. Order may govern reality, but it remains unseen. Light changes that. It reveals what is already there. This is why light is consistently associated with cycles day and night, sunrise and sunset, the shifting of seasons. These are not random occurrences. They are patterns that can be observed, tracked, and eventually understood. Through repeated observation, something critical emerges: recognition. Understanding does not begin with instruction. It begins with noticing. The rising of the sun becomes predictable. The return of seasons becomes expected. The movement of celestial bodies becomes measurable. From this, knowledge begins to form, not through authority, but through experience and observation. This is a fundamental shift from the previous stage. Order imposes structure from above. Light allows that structure to be seen from within. Authority defines the system. Light reveals how the system behaves. This distinction is essential, because once something is seen clearly, it can be questioned, it can be analyzed, it can be understood beyond what authority declares it to be. Light introduces the possibility of independent understanding. It allows the individual to move from passive existence within a system to active awareness of it. This is why light is often associated with awakening. To see the light is not simply to observe. It is to recognize patterns that were previously hidden. It is to move from confusion to clarity, from assumption to recognition. But light, like order, is not without complexity. To see clearly is not always comfortable. Illumination does not discriminate between what is desirable and what is not. It reveals everything: structure, limitation, hierarchy, and constraint. It exposes the system in its entirety. In doing so, it creates tension. Because once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. And once patterns are recognized, the next step becomes inevitable: the desire to act on that understanding. This is where light transitions into something more dangerous, because awareness leads to knowledge. And knowledge, as every myth makes clear, carries consequences. The same light that reveals truth also sets the stage for disruption. It enables advancement, but also challenges authority. It allows understanding, but also invites questioning. This is why the emergence of light is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of something more complex. Because once humans can see, they no longer exist purely within the system. They begin to engage with it. They begin to interpret it, and eventually they begin to change it. This is the threshold between awareness and action, between observation and interference, between understanding and knowledge. And it is from this threshold that the next stage emerges, the moment where awareness becomes something more, the moment where knowledge is no longer just recognized but taken. Before humans can act established and light reveals the structure of reality, something new is introduced into the system, something that does not create it, does not rule it, and does not fully understand it. Humanity. Across traditions, humanity is consistently portrayed as fundamentally different from the gods who shape and govern reality. This distinction appears clearly in figures such as Iapetus in Greek mythology, Adam in the biblical narrative, and Adapa in Mesopotamian texts. Though their stories differ, their role remains consistent. They represent the emergence of beings who exist within the system, not above it. They do not define order. They do not control time. They do not create light. They are subject to all of it. This is the defining characteristic of the human condition: limitation. Humans are bound by time. They are confined to physical form. They experience reality from within, rather than shaping it from outside. This introduces something that does not exist at the level of gods: mortality. Unlike the divine figures who represent enduring forces, authority, time, light, humans are temporary. Their existence unfolds within a beginning and an end. They are born into the system and eventually leave it. This limitation is not merely biological, it shapes perception. Because humans are finite, they cannot see the system in its entirety. They experience it in fragments, moments in time, partial understanding, incomplete perspectives. This is where experience emerges as a defining feature. Humans do not simply observe reality. They live it. They feel it, react to it, struggle within it, and attempt to make sense of it. This experiential nature introduces complexity. Where order is structured and predictable, human experience is variable. Where light reveals patterns, human perception interprets them differently. Where time moves consistently, human awareness of time shifts. This creates a gap between what is and how it is experienced. That gap defines humanity. It is the difference between structure and interpretation, between reality and perception. In myth, this difference is often emphasized through the relationship between humans and gods. Humans seek understanding but are denied full knowledge. They exist within systems they did not create. They are influenced by forces they cannot control. In the story of Adam, humanity is placed within a structured environment, but lacks full awareness of it. In the story of Adapa, knowledge is offered but remains incomplete. In the lineage of Iapetus, humanity inherits traits that connect it to higher forces, but remains bound to mortality. In every case, the message is the same. Humans are not the architects of reality. They are participants within it. But this participation is not passive, because unlike the fixed roles of archetypal forces, time always moving, authority always structuring, humans have something unique: the ability to respond. They can observe, interpret, choose, and act. This introduces agency, not complete control, but the capacity to navigate. Humans cannot escape the system, but they can move within it. They can adapt, learn, and change their relationship to the forces that shape their existence. This is where the human condition becomes dynamic. Because while humans are limited, they are not static. They exist at the intersection of structure, order, awareness, light, limitation, time. And within that intersection, something begins to form. Curiosity, the desire to understand more than what is immediately visible, the impulse to question structure rather than simply accept it, the drive to move beyond limitation, even when constrained by it. This is the turning point. Because once humans begin to question the system they exist within, they no longer remain passive participants. They begin to engage with it. And that engagement leads to the next stage, the pursuit of knowledge. A pursuit that, as every myth makes clear, does not come without consequence. At some point in every system, something changes. Up until this stage, humanity exists within structure, observes through light, and experiences reality under limitation. Humans live inside the system, but do not yet challenge it. Then something enters the equation that alters everything. Knowledge. Not basic awareness, not observation, but something deeper, something that allows humans to act on what they understand. Across cultures, this moment is never portrayed as neutral. It is always presented as dangerous. In Greek mythology, Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. Fire in this context is not just a tool for warmth or survival. It represents technology, intelligence, and the ability to transform the environment. It is the power to create, to build, and to reshape reality itself. For this act, Prometheus is punished, chained, and condemned, a clear indication that this transfer of power was not meant to occur freely. In the biblical narrative, the serpent offers knowledge to Adam and Eve, specifically the knowledge of good and evil. This is not simply moral awareness. It is the recognition of duality, the ability to distinguish, judge, and interpret. Once this knowledge is accepted, innocence is lost. Humanity is no longer unaware. They see themselves, their condition, and their separation from the system that once contained them. In Mesopotamian traditions, figures such as Enki are often associated with the transmission of knowledge to humanity, knowledge that blurs the boundary between human limitation and divine understanding. In some interpretations, this knowledge is not openly given, but mediated, restricted, or selectively revealed. Despite the differences in narrative, the pattern remains consistent. Knowledge is introduced from outside the human condition. It is not naturally possessed, it is acquired. And once acquired, it changes everything. Knowledge represents advancement. It represents awareness beyond simple observation. It represents disobedience, not necessarily in a moral sense, but in a structural one. Because to gain knowledge is to move beyond passive existence. Before this moment, humans live within the system as it is given. After this moment, they begin to interpret, question, and ultimately challenge it. This is why knowledge is so often framed as forbidden, not because it is inherently evil, but because it disrupts established order. Authority defines structure. Knowledge reveals its limitations. Time imposes boundaries. Knowledge seeks ways to move within or beyond them. Perception interprets reality. Knowledge refines and sometimes contradicts those interpretations. This creates tension, because once knowledge is gained, ignorance is no longer possible. The system does not change, but the relationship to it does. Humans begin to recognize patterns not just in nature, but in structure itself. They begin to understand cause and effect, consequence and intention. They develop the ability to anticipate outcomes, to manipulate conditions, and to create new possibilities. This is the true meaning behind the symbolism of fire. Fire transforms, it consumes, reshapes, and creates. It turns raw material into something new. In the same way, knowledge allows humans to transform their environment, their systems, and even their own identity. But this transformation comes at a cost, because knowledge introduces responsibility. To know something is to become accountable for it. To understand a system is to recognize its constraints. To gain awareness is to lose the comfort of not knowing. This is why myths consistently link knowledge with consequence. It is not the acquisition itself that is punished, it is what follows. The shift from innocence to awareness, from participation to understanding, from acceptance to questioning. Knowledge marks the point where humans are no longer simply part of the system, they become active agents within it. They begin to make decisions not just based on instinct or structure, but on understanding. This is the turning point, because once humans act with knowledge, the system begins to respond. And that response leads directly into the next stage, consequence. Not as punishment, but as the natural outcome of awareness applied. Knowledge is never free. It does not arrive without weight. It does not expand awareness without altering the conditions of existence. Once it enters the system, something irreversible occurs. The world does not change, but the way it is experienced does. Across traditions, this shift is never portrayed as neutral. It is marked by a turning point, a moment where the cost of awareness becomes unavoidable. In Greek mythology, Pandora opens the jar that releases suffering into the world. What escapes is not a single force, but a cascade: pain, struggle, uncertainty, and limitation. These were not present in the same way before. Or more precisely, they were not perceived in the same way. The act of opening the jar does not create suffering. It reveals it, unleashes it into human awareness, and ensures it can no longer be ignored. In the biblical narrative, Adam and Eve gain knowledge and are cast out of Eden. This is often framed as punishment, but symbolically it represents something deeper. Eden is not simply a place, it is a state of unawareness, a condition where existence is experienced without distinction, without judgment, without the burden of interpretation. Once knowledge is introduced, that state becomes inaccessible. Humanity becomes aware of itself, of its vulnerability, of its separation. The result is not merely exile, it is self-awareness paired with limitation. Across mythologies, the pattern holds. Once knowledge is gained, innocence is lost. Once awareness expands, simplicity collapses. Once perception deepens, reality becomes more complex. This stage introduces suffering not as an external force imposed from above, but as an internal condition that emerges from awareness itself. To see clearly is to recognize limitation. To understand is to perceive what is lacking. To become aware is to experience contrast. This is where duality enters. Before knowledge, existence is undivided. After knowledge, everything becomes defined in opposition. Good and evil, right and wrong, gain and loss, self and other. These are not just moral categories. They are structural divisions that arise when awareness begins to differentiate. Light reveals, but it also separates. Once something can be distinguished, it can be judged. Once it can be judged, it can be valued. Once it is valued, it can be desired or rejected. This is the beginning of internal conflict. Because awareness does not simply illuminate the external world, it turns inward. Humans begin to observe themselves, their actions, their thoughts, their limitations. They recognize not just what is, but what could be and what is not. This gap between reality and possibility is where suffering takes root. It is not just physical hardship. It is psychological, existential. The awareness of time brings the awareness of death. The awareness of structure brings the awareness of constraint. The awareness of self brings the awareness of vulnerability. This is the true cost of knowledge, not punishment, but responsibility. To know something is to carry it. To understand something is to live with it. To see clearly is to lose the ability to ignore. This responsibility transforms the role of humanity within the system. Before knowledge, humans exist within structure. After knowledge, they must navigate it. They must make decisions. They must evaluate outcomes. They must take ownership of their actions. The system becomes more complex, not because it has changed, but because the human relationship to it has deepened. What was once experienced as simple existence becomes layered. Perception influences belief. Belief influences action. Action produces consequence. And consequence feeds back into perception. This creates a loop, one that reinforces itself over time. Suffering in this sense is not separate from awareness. It is intertwined with it. Because to be aware is to recognize both potential and limitation, to see both what is possible and what is constrained. This is why the myths consistently present this stage as unavoidable. Once knowledge enters the system, consequence follows, not as retribution, but as structure. It is the natural outcome of awareness applied within a limited framework. And as consequence accumulates, systems begin to strain. Imbalance grows. Tension builds. Structures that once held stability begin to weaken. This leads to the next stage. Not gradual change, but collapse. A reset that clears what has become unsustainable. A return in some form to the edge of chaos so the cycle can begin again. When systems become unstable, they collapse. Not suddenly and not without cause, but inevitably. Every system, no matter how structured, no matter how well-defined, carries within it the conditions for its own breakdown. As knowledge expands, as consequence accumulates, as imbalance grows, tension begins to build beneath the surface. At first, this tension is subtle. Small misalignments, minor disruptions, gradual shifts in balance. But over time, these pressures compound. What was once stable becomes strained. What was once ordered becomes rigid. What was once functional begins to fail. And eventually, the system can no longer sustain itself. It breaks. Across mythologies, this moment is almost always represented the same way: a flood. In Greek tradition, Deucalion survives a catastrophic deluge that wipes away the existing world. In the biblical narrative, Noah endures a flood that resets humanity. In Mesopotamian texts, Utnapishtim lives through a similar event, preserving life while everything else is destroyed. Different names, different cultures, but the same pattern. The flood is not merely destruction, it is reset. Water, which once represented the undifferentiated potential of chaos, returns, not as a beginning, but as a force that dissolves what has become too rigid, too imbalanced, too unsustainable. It washes away structure, it removes accumulated consequence, it breaks down systems that can no longer function. This is why collapse is not portrayed as random. It is not chaos returning without reason. It is a response, a correction, a rebalancing of forces that have drifted too far from equilibrium. Where order once imposed structure and knowledge once introduced complexity, collapse removes what can no longer hold. It strips systems back to their foundations. It reduces them to something simpler, something that can begin again. This is the paradox of collapse. It appears as destruction, but functions as renewal. It feels like an ending, but operates as a transition. Nothing within the system is truly lost in a fundamental sense. The patterns remain. The structures are not erased, they are reset. The flood does not eliminate reality. It clears it. It removes the accumulated weight of imbalance so that a new cycle can emerge. This is why, in every version of the story, something survives. A single individual, a pair, a remnant. There is always a continuity, a thread that carries forward into the next phase. This surviving element is not accidental. It represents persistence. The idea that while systems collapse, the underlying pattern does not disappear. It adapts. It reemerges in a new form. Collapse, then, is not failure. It is function. It is what allows systems to evolve rather than remain trapped in unsustainable states. Without collapse, imbalance would continue indefinitely. Structures would grow rigid, consequence would accumulate without release, and the system would eventually stagnate. Collapse prevents that. It restores movement. It returns the system to a state where renewal becomes possible. This is the deeper meaning of the flood, not simply destruction, but the dissolution of what no longer serves. Not chaos for its own sake, but chaos as a corrective force. And once the waters recede, once the structure has been cleared, something remains. Not the same world, but the potential for a new one. From this point, the cycle does not end, it begins again. But not identically, because what survives carries memory, however subtle, of what came before. And from that memory, the next stage emerges. Renewal. After collapse comes renewal. The flood recedes. The waters withdraw. The structures that once defined the world have been stripped away, reduced, dissolved into something quieter, simpler, and more open. Where there was once complexity, there is now space. Where there was once tension, there is now stillness. And within that stillness, something remains, a survivor. In Greek tradition, Deucalion stands at the edge of a cleared world. In the biblical account, Noah emerges from the ark into a landscape washed clean. In Mesopotamian texts, Utnapishtim endures beyond destruction, carrying forward the thread of existence. Different names, different stories, but the same idea persists. Collapse does not erase everything. It preserves just enough. This is what defines renewal, not the recreation of what was, but the continuation of what remains. This stage represents adaptation. It represents persistence. It represents evolution, because what survives is not identical to what existed before. It has been shaped by collapse. It carries the imprint of what failed, what endured, and what could not be sustained. Renewal is not a return to the past. It is a movement forward from it. The system begins again, but not from the same position. Something has changed. Something has been learned, even if not consciously. Structures that once dominated no longer exist in the same form. Patterns that led to imbalance have been disrupted. The weight of accumulated consequence has been lifted. This creates the conditions for something new to emerge. But this new beginning is quieter, less defined, more fragile. Because renewal does not begin with full structure, it begins with possibility. The survivor stands between two states, the memory of what was lost and the uncertainty of what comes next. This is where adaptation becomes essential, because survival alone is not enough. To continue, the system must adjust. It must reorganize. It must rebuild. It must find new balance within the conditions that now exist. This is why renewal is closely tied to persistence. Not all elements of the previous system survive, but those that do must endure through change. They must carry forward what is essential while allowing everything else to evolve. This process is not immediate. It unfolds gradually. Small actions, subtle shifts, incremental rebuilding. From these, new patterns begin to form. And over time, these patterns grow into structure. This is where evolution emerges. Not as a sudden transformation, but as a result of repeated adaptation over time. The system does not simply restart, it refines itself. It becomes capable of sustaining new forms, new structures, new relationships. Yet within this renewal, there is always a tension, because while the system begins again, it is still bound by the same underlying forces. Time continues to move. Structure begins to reemerge. Awareness develops again. The cycle does not disappear, it resets. This is the deeper meaning of renewal. It is not freedom from the cycle. It is re-entry into it, but with the potential for change. The possibility that the next iteration may unfold differently, not because the system itself has changed, but because the way it is engaged has evolved. This is why renewal is both hopeful and uncertain. It offers continuation, but not certainty. It provides opportunity, but not guarantee. It opens the path forward, but does not define where it leads. And from this state, this balance between what remains and what is yet to be formed, something else begins to emerge. Not just survival, not just rebuilding, but connection. A bridge between what was, what is, and what could be. And it is through this bridge that the next stage unfolds. Some figures do not belong entirely to one domain. They are not purely rulers, not purely mortals, not purely creators, and not purely observers. They stand in between. They move across boundaries that others remain confined within. They translate what is hidden. They carry messages from one layer of reality into another. These are the bridge figures. In Greek tradition, this role is embodied most clearly by Hermes. In symbolic and theological readings, a similar mediating role can be seen in Jesus, not as a direct equivalent, but as a figure whose significance rests in connection, transmission, and the crossing of boundaries. These figures represent translation of knowledge, movement between realms, communication of truth, They are not bound to one layer of reality. This is what makes them different from the archetypes that came before. Authority governs structure, but remains within the logic of order. Humanity lives within the system, but does not transcend it. Knowledge disrupts the system, but does not necessarily reconcile its divisions. Collapse resets the world, and renewal restarts it, but neither explains how meaning travels across layers. The bridge does. The bridge archetype appears when separation has already been established. By this point in the cycle, reality has been divided into categories: divine and human, order and chaos, seen and unseen, innocence and awareness, life and transformation. These divisions create tension. They make experience possible, but they also produce distance. Something must move between these distances. Something must carry understanding from one side to another. This is where Hermes becomes essential. Hermes is not simply a messenger in the ordinary sense. He is not just someone who delivers information from one point to another. He is the archetype of mediation itself. He crosses thresholds. He moves between gods and mortals, between the living and the dead, between order and movement. He is associated with roads, trade, speech, cunning, interpretation, and travel, not because these things are random, but because they all involve passage. He is the figure of transition. He does not belong to a single fixed place because his role is to connect places that would otherwise remain isolated. He translates not only words but meaning. He enables movement not only across physical space, but across symbolic and conceptual boundaries. This is why the bridge archetype is so important. Without it, truth remains inaccessible. Without it, knowledge remains fragmented. Without it, systems remain closed. The bridge opens what structure closes. It does not destroy order. It makes order permeable. This same symbolic function can be applied in a very different context to Jesus as mediator. Again, this is not a claim that Hermes and Jesus are the same figure. Their stories, theological roles, and meanings differ deeply. But in the archetypal structure being built here, both occupy a bridging position. Jesus, in symbolic terms, represents the crossing point between divine truth and human experience. He stands at the threshold between realms, bringing teaching into history, spirit into flesh, transcendence into suffering. His significance is not only in what he says, but in what he connects. He joins what had been separated, the divine and the human, truth and embodiment, suffering and transformation. This is why the bridge figure often carries a paradoxical quality. It belongs to both sides, yet fully to neither. It speaks in one realm but is understood in another. It moves through structure without being confined to it. That in-between quality is not weakness, it is function, because the bridge is not meant to dominate reality. It is meant to make movement through reality possible. This archetype appears in many forms beyond Hermes and Jesus. It can be seen in any figure that carries insight from one domain into another: scribes, prophets, messengers, intermediaries, guides. In some traditions, the bridge speaks through language. In others, through self-sacrifice. In others, through descent and return. But the pattern remains consistent. A boundary exists. A separation is established. A figure appears who can cross it. This crossing is never trivial. It changes both sides. Once truth is translated into human terms, humanity changes. Once knowledge moves from the hidden into the visible is altered. Once a message arrives, the recipient is no longer where they were before receiving it. This is why communication of truth is not merely informational, it is transformational. To communicate truth across realms is to alter the structure of experience itself. That is what makes the bridge archetype so powerful. It does not simply carry facts, it carries access. It creates the possibility that what was once unreachable can now be approached, interpreted, and lived. This also explains why bridge figures are often linked with danger or tension. Hermes is associated not only with communication, but with ambiguity, speed, and trickery. Messages can clarify, but they can also disrupt. Translation can reveal truth, but it can also destabilize what had been assumed. A bridge does not merely connect, it also exposes the fact that separation was never absolute. This can be liberating, but it can also be unsettling, Because once movement between realms becomes possible, old boundaries lose some of their certainty. The bridge introduces fluidity into systems built on division. It allows the mortal to glimpse what had seemed inaccessible. It allows the structured world to be interrupted by meaning from beyond itself. And once that happens, the cycle shifts again. Because connection is never the final stage. Once truth has been carried across, it must be received. Once movement between realms is possible, those realms cannot remain unchanged. Once communication opens the boundary, transformation follows. The bridge does not end the cycle. It prepares the way for the next phase, a phase in which what has been transmitted is no longer merely understood from a distance, but absorbed, lived, and embodied. That phase is transformation. The final stage is not an end, it is a shift. After structure has been imposed, after awareness has emerged, after knowledge has been taken, consequences experienced, systems collapsed and renewal begun. Something deeper begins to take place, not outside the system, within the individual. Transformation is not simply change. It is not adjustment, adaptation, or reaction. It is a reconfiguration of identity itself. This stage represents identity change, awareness, evolution, but not in a superficial sense. Transformation is the moment where the individual no longer just participates in the system, observes it, or reacts to it, but recognizes it, sees it, understands its structure, its patterns, its cycles, and most importantly, recognizes their place within it. Up until this point, each stage of the cycle has acted upon the individual. Chaos formed the foundation. Order structured reality. Light revealed patterns. Knowledge disrupted innocence. Consequence introduced complexity. Collapse reset the system. Renewal continued existence. The bridge connected layers. But transformation is different. It is the first stage where the individual begins to act with awareness of the entire process. This is the shift, not from ignorance to knowledge that has already happened, but from knowledge to integration. Because knowledge alone does not transform. Understanding something does not automatically change who you are. Transformation occurs when understanding becomes embodied, when it moves from observation into identity. This is where the system becomes internal, no longer something external to navigate, but something reflected within thought, behavior, and perception. The individual begins to see patterns not just in myth or structure, but in themselves. Cycles of action and consequence, patterns of belief and perception, repetitions of growth, failure, and renewal. What was once seen as separate becomes interconnected. The external system and the internal experience begin to mirror each other. This is awareness at a different level. Not awareness of objects or events, but awareness of patterns, of structure, of recurrence. This is why transformation is often described symbolically as death and rebirth. Not physical death, but the dissolution of a previous identity. The version of the self that existed before understanding cannot remain unchanged. It no longer aligns with what is now seen, so it shifts. Old assumptions fall away. Previous frameworks break down. New perspectives emerge. This process is rarely comfortable, because identity is not easily altered. It is built over time, reinforced through experience, shaped by belief and perception. To transform is to question those foundations, to examine what has been accepted without awareness, to recognize what has been repeated without intention, and to decide consciously what remains and what changes. This introduces a new level of responsibility, not just for actions, but for interpretation. Because once patterns are seen, they can no longer be ignored. The individual becomes accountable not only for what they do, but for how they understand what they do. This is where evolution occurs, not as a biological process, but as a shift in consciousness. A movement from reacting to systems toward engaging with them deliberately. The system itself has not changed. Time still moves. Structure still exists. Cycles still repeat. But the relationship to it has. Instead of being carried through the cycle unconsciously, the individual begins to move through it with intention, to recognize when patterns repeat, to identify where imbalance forms, to adjust before collapse becomes necessary. This is what separates transformation from previous stages. It introduces the possibility of awareness within the cycle, not escape from it, but navigation through it. This is often misunderstood. Transformation is not transcendence in the sense of leaving reality behind. It is not separation from structure, time, or consequence. It is deeper involvement, but with clarity. To be transformed is not to be outside the system. It is to be within it, fully aware of its nature. This awareness creates space between perception and reaction, between knowledge and action, between consequence and repetition. In that space, something new becomes possible. Choice. Not absolute control, but the ability to respond differently, to engage with patterns consciously rather than unconsciously, to shift direction without needing collapse to force it. This is the culmination of the cycle, not as an ending, but as a new level of participation. Because once transformation occurs, the cycle does not stop. It continues, but now it is experienced differently. The same stages remain: chaos, order, awareness, knowledge, consequence, but they are no longer encountered blindly. They are recognized, understood, engaged with. And in that engagement, the system evolves, not in its structure, but in how it is lived. This is the true meaning of transformation. Not becoming something entirely different, but becoming aware of what you are within the system and choosing how to move through it. Putting it all together, a pattern emerges, one that is not confined to a single story, culture, or moment in time, but repeats across every layer of existence. Source, order, understanding, humanity, knowledge, consequence, collapse, renewal, bridge, transformation. At first, this sequence can appear linear, as if reality moves from beginning to end, from origin to conclusion. But it does not. It loops, it repeats, it returns. This is the fundamental realization of the system. Reality does not move in a straight line. It moves in cycles. What begins in chaos does not remain there. It becomes structured. That structure becomes visible. That visibility leads to awareness. Awareness leads to knowledge. Knowledge produces consequence. Consequence builds tension. Tension leads to collapse. Collapse clears the system. Renewal begins again. The bridge reconnects what was separated. Transformation integrates the entire process. And then quietly, almost imperceptibly, the cycle starts again. Not in the same form, but with the same structure. This is why cycles can be difficult to recognize. They do not repeat identically. They evolve. They appear in different contexts, with different characters under different conditions. But beneath those differences, the same sequence unfolds, the same stages, the same transitions, the same movement from potential to structure, from structure to awareness, from awareness to disruption, from disruption to reset, and from reset to renewal. This is not limited to mythology. It can be seen in the rise and fall of civilizations, the growth and collapse of systems, the patterns of individual behavior, the cycles of learning, failure, and transformation. A person begins in uncertainty, chaos. They adopt structure, rules, habits, beliefs. They begin to understand those structures. They act within them. They gain knowledge. They experience consequences. They reach a breaking point. They reset. They rebuild. They change. And then, eventually, they find themselves at the beginning again, facing a new form of the same cycle. This is not repetition in the sense of stagnation. It is repetition in the sense of refinement. Each cycle carries forward what came before it, not always consciously, but structurally. Patterns learned in one cycle influence the next. Mistakes made in one stage shape behavior in another. Awareness gained in transformation affects how the next cycle begins. This creates something important: depth. The cycle is not a flat loop, it is more like a spiral. It returns to familiar points, but not at the same level. Each pass introduces the possibility of greater awareness, more refined understanding, and more deliberate action. But this is not guaranteed, because cycles can also repeat without awareness. The same patterns can play out again and again if they are not recognized. The same consequences can arise from the same actions. The same collapses can follow the same imbalances. This is what creates the sense of being stuck within a cycle. Not because the system traps the individual, but because the pattern has not been seen clearly enough to change. This is where transformation becomes critical, because transformation is the stage that introduces awareness of the cycle itself. Without it, the cycle continues unconsciously. With it, the cycle becomes something that can be engaged with intentionally. This is the difference between being carried through reality and moving through it with awareness. The cycle does not disappear, it cannot be escaped. Chaos will always exist as potential, order will always structure reality, knowledge will always introduce consequence, collapse will always follow imbalance. These are not optional stages, they are structural, but how they are experienced, how they unfold within an individual or a system can change. That is where awareness matters. Because once the cycle is seen, it becomes something more than a sequence of events. It becomes a map, a framework, a way of understanding where you are, what has led to that position, and what may come next. This does not provide control in the absolute sense. It does not eliminate uncertainty, but it introduces orientation, the ability to recognize patterns as they emerge, to identify when a system is moving toward imbalance, to see when collapse is approaching, not as failure, but as transition, and to understand that renewal will follow. This is the deeper meaning of the cycle of reality. Not that everything repeats endlessly without change, but that change itself follows a pattern that can be observed, understood, and over time, engaged with more consciously. The cycle does not end, it continues. But once it is recognized, it is no longer invisible, and that recognition changes everything.